Welcome back, everyone, and thanks for joining us on the Building Bigger Lives podcast. I'm Michael Regan, along with my co-host, Kathryn Peterson, and we're excited today to discuss and break down one of our most fundamental topics at Building Champions. Some may argue the cornerstone of what we do as a coaching company over the last 28 years, as we help people establish what is commonly called a life plan. And I'd rather today in our podcast spend some time talking about the fundamental value of a life plan, or maybe better stated, rather than the what, let's focus a little bit on the why, because so many of us are familiar with life planning as a concept, but we've seen it introduced in many different ways. And there are, thousands of people out in our world that call themselves life coaches. And often those life coaches will use tools that look like life planning. And that may have been your introduction to life planning if you're one of our followers. I'm not as interested in saying this is right or wrong. I want to ask all of us to suspend judgment as we listen and really choose to explore the idea of, is there something new I could learn about life planning, whether I'm a beginner to this process or I've tried this before and I wasn't really that excited by it. Maybe tried it before and it went well for a while, but I lost track of it. Or maybe I'm a Jedi master. I could teach the whole subject. So I want to lay out life planning in its most fundamental form and really explore the why behind it. But before I ramble much further, let me bring in my my co-host, because she is also a practicing expert on the topic, Kathryn Peterson. Great to be with you today.
Good to see you, Michael. And this is such an important topic for us to discuss because really everything else is based on this. So it'll be a good one.
Yeah, thanks for joining me on this journey, both today and over the last 9 years, because as we've spent time in the Building Champions program, we've both been affected by this. I think, you, if I remember correctly, might have been introduced to life planning at one of our Building Champions experiences where you had a half day in which to really dig into the first draft of this. Take yourself back in time if you can, and just think about where you were emotionally and maybe professionally at a time where a life plan was introduced to you. How did you first react when you heard the concept, and what were some of the things that might have interested you about the concept?
So for me, what I like is focusing on the end first, digging into the relationships that are important, and then figuring out what to do to keep and build those relationships so that they're long lasting. And that could be even your relationship with a hobby, or it could be relationships with people, but it's a little bit of both to say, okay, what are the important parts of my life if I have to narrow it down to 7 or so? And what am I going to do in my calendar and in my life to make sure that I'm building deposits in those accounts?
Okay, you're already using some language that I want to make sure our audience is tracking with,
Yes.
because you are a practicing life planner, but you've definitely got some language there. So begin with the end in mind. This is a concept that is much older than Building Champions. It's a concept that's not uncommon in the planning process on many different applications. But the idea is orienting towards some future date in which some future outcome can be visualized at such a clear level that anyone would easily say, yes, that's inspiring to me. That's where I want to be. That's who I want to be. That's who I want to be with. That's, they can visualize that in such a way. And by the way, before this sounds too mystical or weird, this is no different than what any of us went through that maybe we're high school students and someone told us to take an SAT so we could start applying for college. Well, we had to envision, well, what would going to college look like? And so we began to explore that, and we researched colleges. Maybe we went on a site visit to a college. We talked to guidance counselors. Maybe some of us in a different version of life did this with a career counselor, and we were exploring things through different trade schools or different certification programs where we could study or apprentice to be, an electrician, a plumber, whatever we might have ended up choosing to be. But we had to visualize that at some point in order to orient toward, well, then what would be the necessary steps for me to get from where I am to where I'm going? So I love that you started with begin with the end in mind. What version of the begin with the end in mind exercise do you remember us working with when you first drafted your life plan? What was the exercise that kicked that into motion?
It was essentially you were writing out what you wanted at a funeral. What do you want people to say about you? And what do you want your life to have looked like at that point? And the people that you've influenced in your life, what do you want them to remember about you?
Yeah, that's you're 100% correct. We create a storyline around a funeral setting, not to be morbid, not to be dark, but to be honest. I mean, I think all of our listeners are comfortable with this statement. None of us get out of here alive. Like at some point, our lives are accounted for. And regardless of your belief of the afterlife, I don't mean to imply that if someone's out there saying, "What does he mean?" Well, we'll save the theology for a later episode. Today, the fact is, at some point, a funeral represents an event in time in which all of us understand what that atmosphere is like. So whether we call it a celebration of life or a traditional funeral, at some point your life is reviewed by the people who are still living. And they'll say, this is what Kathryn meant to me, or this is what I remember about Kathryn, or this is how Kathryn impacted my life, or whatever they choose to say. And it's helpful for us to be sober to that, to realize that if we were to die today, where we stand presently is exactly the information they would have in order to share those thoughts. And that can be really humbling to some of us who've had a difficult life or have made some difficult choices, or maybe aren't happy with the results we've seen so far, relationally, professionally, physically, wherever we are. So it's an exercise designed to get everybody humble and real before we cast out into a future in which we say, hey, good news. Today's not that day. You may still have some time on the clock. And whether that's tomorrow or a week or a year or a decade, whatever that looks like, let's start orienting from today's point out into that future. And let's talk about what would happen if you could change some things that would change the outcomes of what they might remember or what they might say. How did that feel to you when you had to put that anchor point with today back in, what was that, 2015, I think? And now, I mean, here we literally are almost 10 years later. How did that feel to you as a professional at that time? And what could you share with our audience that might help them get comfortable with that exercise?
Yeah, so one of the examples was spending time with my family, of course, and I kind of broke it down by kid because the kids are very different in what they think is fun, right? And you spend different time doing different things with different kids. And so it was kind of looking at that separate, saying, okay, what's going to be important as far as my time with them? And based on, let's say, their love language or based on what they like to do, that'll be impactful for them moving forward. And then getting that kind of scheduled out, like, hey, every night I'm going to read to Kayla, or every night I'm going to, snuggle Abby. That it's what's going to work for the kid, and how does that look for you? And what's then their perception of you in 10 years, and what does that look like?
Yeah, if you're working toward an outcome that you can envision, one of a probably just a couple of tracks are going to be available to you. One is going to be, I want to do better. The
Mhm.
other is, hey, I feel really good about this. I don't want to fall off. I want to keep that up. That's working really well.
Mhm.
So let's go back to the funeral setting just for a moment, and then I promise we won't spend our episode talking about funerals.
Good.
Imagine we're sitting, and just for the sake of your example, this is your celebration of life, and Todd and Abby and Kayla are sitting in the front row. Your sisters are there, and then in a couple rows behind them are a bunch of people, maybe some folks from, CU, maybe some neighbors, maybe some friends you've made along the way. And then somewhere in the back of the room, maybe even standing in the back, are some of the real estate agents you've worked with or some of the clients you've served. They're all there in the room. One of the things that we really want to grab attention with this tool is, let's be careful if at that moment we've anchored today and we looked out in that future, if we're on the track that says, I'm not happy with where I am with the people that mean most to me, we would say, let's be careful to imagine a future in which you said the most important people were in the first two rows, but you spent all of your time with the people standing in the back. It's not that they're not all in the room to honor your
Mhm.
memory, it's that there's a certain priority to the relationships of the family you've been given and the network of really close friends that you've been given. And sometimes we forget that as professionals in our daily routine. We fill up our calendar and our day with, appointments with clients that we care about. We fill our appointments with partners that we care about, but we do that at the expense sometimes of our family members and our close friends who we think, oh, they'll understand. I can cancel that. I'll be late for dinner. Oh, I can make that up. And if that's the measurement of our lives, we're trying to get them to visualize what would that look like down the road if that's the path you choose, and will you be really happy with that path? It's a tough exercise, but when we start there, it gives us a lot of different outcomes like you began to describe. So let's play that forward. How did you identify the categories you wanted to put in your first draft of the life plan? I mean, you obviously mentioned your husband and your kids, but there had to be other categories.
Mhm.
How did you pick those?
Yeah, so for me, there was also just having some fun. And I think it's hard for some people to even pick hobbies or know what is a hobby.
Hmm.
So I think that tends to be one. And sometimes there's just samples that you can get to, which can be helpful. Obviously, health is one. If you're not here, you can't serve your family or your clients. And so that's obviously always one of my accounts is health. And then it can be things like great work. Let's still have some goals around that for your life plan because it is part of the plan. It could be education, it could be spiritual, it could be so many different things. And I think for me, I just looked at it and said, okay, where are the important things for me to be spending time on? Family, friends, health, personal development and growth, and fun.
That's great. You referenced those earlier, calling them accounts, and I think that's because the language you and I were introduced to this in was a little bit like banking, and the idea was if these accounts exist. So I'll just riff on the ones that you mentioned. There's family, there's health, there's fun, there's career. Those are just some hobbies. These are some examples of things that you referenced. The idea is if those were accounts, then like a bank account, if we make deposits into those accounts on a regular basis, we're building equity, we're building value in those accounts. And that means at future dates, we're able to leverage that equity appropriately, which means we can take a withdrawal and we can spend and we can do things with it. You and I, having come from a lending background, know what it's like when someone tries to draw on an account that has no equity. That's a painful day when that moment comes for folks, and then you could make the argument that that's the bridge to borrowing. That's when we start living on, credit card debt. Well, same thing in our life accounts. If we start borrowing against that equity, we're now asking that area of our life to take on some debt in order to
Mhm.
pay for something else. Often we see this with our professional friends in the health account. They maybe don't take care of their physical health or their mental health or their spiritual health, and that creates a deficit in which they think they're using that time differently somewhere else that matters. But at some point, if you can't, it's the old oxygen mask analogy, if you can't breathe, you're really not very capable of helping someone else. So I'm so glad you gave us a few examples like that. What happened next? So you created these accounts. What did it look like once you envisioned in your career, in your family, with your hobbies, any of these? How did you orient that account toward a future, and what were your next steps?
So each person has a little bit of a vision that you put together. So you say, it might look like, hey, Kayla's an adult or she's at college, which now she is. And we talk every day. She comes to me with problems. She looks up to me as a hard worker. We have a close, tight relationship. It might be something of that sort. And then it's breaking it down to say, okay, what are going to be the activities that we make sure to do to build to that future? So does that look like weekly time together? What am I doing to deposit into that account for her?
One of the things I've seen you do over the last 3 or 4 years is you've developed a habit using a mobile video app, and that seems to give you a high level of engagement. I'm pretty sure you couldn't have known what that concept was in 2015, but you
Right.
knew directionally you would want to make those kind of deposits. And so that's an interesting example where people, I hope, can connect with this is you may not always be able to envision the precise details, but this is like a compass. You know where true north is, and you know where to aim in that relationship. And then as something like that comes along, you can say, oh, Marco Polo, I just thought that was some guy lost in the history books. Turns out that's also the name of a really cool app that helps me stay in touch with my daughter or my sister or my friends.
Absolutely. I think that the execution, as long as you're clear on the vision, the execution will happen. And contacting my daughter daily and giving her a Marco Polo daily is part of my daily habits, which is creating that vision that we now have.
So good. Yeah, I think that's what people need to hear when they envision this, because life planning can sometimes sound to folks, when I've done this, I don't know how many hundreds of times now over the last 15 years, they tend to think of it at first a little bit like, oh, so this is like a budget. Like I even see my face. Like that's the way they get it. Like, okay, that's gonna limit me in some way. And I try to flip that exactly the opposite direction with them and
Mhm,
say, what if a budget was simply telling your money what to do so you were free to use your money where you want to use it instead
mhm.
of being forced to do things that you wouldn't want to do simply because you thought through the outcome first and you worked it backwards. Well, most people
Yeah.
would say, okay, well, that sounds different. And same thing with a life plan. This isn't boxing yourself into a robotic execution of activities. It's actually the opposite. It's weeding out a lot of the wasted time and wasted energy that we would all say later, yeah, that wasn't leading me to an outcome I cared about. But we're all capable of sliding into habits where we just lose time. And the purpose of this exercise is to get us to be acutely aware that we all live with a clock that's
Mhm.
ticking and we want to use that time wisely, including having fun. That's something you touched on earlier, so I want to expand on that. This isn't just, the deep stuff like your career and your family and your health. It is also the activities around your creativity and your curiosity and your fun. Tell me an example of where you might draft something in your life plan that has an orientation toward a future in which you envision that's really fun, and how you were able to work that backwards and create some steps that you just built into a habit.
So one example for me is getting outside and hiking is huge. And even though I'm like, oh, I'm going to hike, actually putting it in a life plan can be good because I know it's so good for my mental health to get outside and do that. And creating some of those spaces is good. We now have a second home, and that is definitely a place that I go for refuge and a place that I can relax and kind of chill out a little bit. And so I think it depends on what's going to work for the specific person, but it can be lots of different things. Something that I was really proud of last year was that we went, finally, that was in my life plan. I took a trip with both the girls to New York to see some live production. And that was so great to be able to fulfill that in my life plan and take the girls on a trip, just the three of us, and we had a blast. And they were like, "We need to do this every year." So it was definitely fulfilling to see it and then actually do it.
Those are two great examples. One is more of a practical, achievable example that involves a discipline. The other
Mhm.
is a less practical, more aspirational, but would require some real discipline around savings and planning and preparing. And both of those had a place in your life plan, and both of those helped you stay focused on,
Mhm.
hey, if that's an outcome that I want, is to build that memory with my daughters, I've got to put the energy into that. And I can't just keep pushing that off. And many of us that are really highly productive people can be guilty of this. We get so consumed with our productive lives in a daily routine that maybe the hiking one seems like, okay, I could do that, but yeah, I'll get to Europe when I get to Europe, or I'll get to that
Mm.
thing, whatever that thing is. And the risk of that is that at some point in time, we might experience a version of life that we didn't prepare for, we didn't plan for. Life planning isn't as much about a dictation of the way things have to go. It's an orientation toward the way we want things to go so that we can take ownership over the one day we have, which is today, and keep making steps toward the next day that we're given and the next day we're given. And the outcome might be a beautiful memory like you created with your
Mhm.
daughters. And that's so important for people to hear because life doesn't always go the way we want it to. Have you experienced that at all where you maybe wrote something a few years back and you envisioned it going differently than it's gone? Well, I don't mean to dig into
No,
anything you
that's
don't
it.
choose to share.
No, it's one thing with that same example is COVID. There were a lot of trips and time that we had to cancel, and that's part of it. So that's, we didn't go to New York till after that. There was no shows to see if we could have gotten there. So obviously, things like that, you have to adjust and you have to change, and that's okay too.
Yeah, I think everybody can relate to that example. And that's a really appropriate one because if COVID wasn't in our plan and yet we all had to deal with it, I suppose you could argue, in my analogy of a compass, that at some point our orientation toward where we're going didn't change, but we definitely got blown off course. And there's an
Mhm.
old saying, a poor sailor blames the wind, a good sailor adjusts her sails. And those of us during COVID that had some events that we couldn't control might have felt like, I don't know how to adjust my sails. I don't even know if I want to be in the boat anymore.
Mhm.
That was a very real feeling. So I think what you have to look at in a moment like that is, well, would I prefer to be on this journey with a a map and a compass, or would I prefer to just be on this journey and let life happen as it happens? Most people that I meet tell me, well, I don't like the idea of going to the airport today to take a flight, only to find out I don't even know if a ticket is booked. I don't even know where the destination is. I have no idea if the pilot logged a flight plan. That would cause a lot of stress for most people, and they probably don't get on that plane. So life planning is a little bit like that. We may not be able to control what happens to the plane once it's in the air. There could be, in fact, I read a statistic that a flight from the West Coast to the East Coast, vice versa, could be east to west, is only on course about 1% of the time. The rest of the flight,
Mm.
the plane is adjusting to the weather all around it, and the pilot is acutely aware of those adjustments to keep us oriented toward the destination. That's really what a life plan can do. So COVID is a really great example of life happened to all of us in a way that looked differently than we envisioned. The next question was, how were we going to deal with that? And were we going
Mhm.
to give up on those visions and those dreams? Um, okay, carry that forward, and then we can land on this one because I think there's a lot more to talk about in the future of
Mhm.
life planning. Are there any, go back to the actual documentation of your first life plan, if you would, and finish here. As you executed on that day, what were some of the great tips or takeaways that you remember being true in that moment that you would advise anyone who might be ready to explore that journey? What were some of the things that worked well for you?
So I think being open to the process was huge as far as just, hey, really dive in and what does that look like? And then ask yourself, what else could I do in this? What else could I do with this? What else could I do for this person? How else could I bring this deeper? Because it does take some serious thinking to really pump those out because you're like, it's fine, but what can I do to up the game? What can I do to focus in a little bit more on this? So it's just kind of digging in and spending enough time with it that you're not racing through it. So I think like we did at Building Champions Experience, we had that whole 4-ish hours. And I thought, God, that's going to be way too much time. But really, it does give you time to review it again, and really make those updates and dive into that process.
So I heard a couple of things there that I hope our listeners heard. One is be open. Don't be
Mhm.
closed-minded, be open to the process. Another is be curious. Ask those questions like you were asking, what else could I try? What else could
Mhm.
I do? That's an example of your curiosity. And I think the third takeaway there was leave yourself ample time. And I'll expand on that one to say, I've seen this mistake happen with folks, especially, again, they're well intended. Hey, I've got an hour here. Hey, I've got 90 minutes there. I got another hour there. I can figure out how to do all this and get it done. And then they deliver their first draft of a life plan that looks a little bit like a Frankenstein's monster. Like we've bolted on an arm, we've bolted on a
Mhm.
leg, we've tried our best to make this thing feel cohesive. But because it was written in different moments of time, the person writing it was in a different headspace. And so they
Mhm.
may have been more open one moment, not as open the next, because something was going on that changed their mindset. So a key to that is, I think when you talked about the experiences, finding a place in which you can be free from distractions, along with an ample amount of time to really complete the first draft is highly advisable. There are plenty of other tips I could share, but I would start with those two: is dedicate the time and the place in which to really focus on this uninterrupted. And once you've done that, to your point, now you have a draft and you can review it and you can refine it. Um, but when you try to do it piecemeal, that tends to be when it's not as cohesive and it's maybe a little harder to figure out where to execute once you've drafted it. So that's a great takeaway on your part. Any closing thoughts on the beginning of life planning as a topic? We said let's focus on the why. Any final thoughts on the why now that you've had a decade under your belt of this experience that you started and you've been living with it that you'd want to share with our audience?
I think it's really important to think through what you want your life to be before life happens and before you don't have a choice anymore. So I think it's a good tool to do. And we'll add multiple episodes of Now That You Have a Life Plan, Now What? And we'll dig into this a lot more. But I think that just that starting point is so big. So if you can spend a little bit of time and get that done, that's highly recommended.
That's so good. I'll land on this and then we'll tie down. My hope is that what you've heard today is an introduction to an opportunity in which to use a well-designed tool to get thoughts out of your head and onto paper so you can explore your why. So the why for me as a coach is really inviting someone else into an opportunity to explore their why, to get clear on not just what they want, but why it's so important to them and why they would choose to do things differently in order to change the trajectory of the potential outcomes they're going to have. If I can help someone think through that, at some point, once they're convinced that that's worth doing, the process really takes over and it's so well designed they can start now letting it flow. And once that happens, probably best for me to then get out of the way, let them do that, and then really enjoy coming back to it when they've completed it to talk about, okay, what's next? Now I've written this great story about the future, but I'm still here at that starting point that you talked about at the beginning. How do I start closing that gap? And that's where, as a coach, I get to enjoy joining them on the journey and helping keep them on track and keep them oriented as real life happens, and reminding them that, hey, remember, you said this was important. Let me know if that's changed, because if it hasn't, we may want to get back on track with that. Maybe the best analogy to leave with is it's a lot like a GPS. We all understand when we plug an address into our phones to guide us somewhere today. This powerful tool is really looking through a satellite at the Earth, and it's positioning an axis and a radius to that destination that we typed in. And once we've done that, it gives us several routes, and so does your life plan. It says, "Oh, here's a fast route, here's the short route, or here's a scenic route." You get to choose. The good news is that in real life, when those life events happen, like COVID, and we get knocked off of one of those courses that we chose, the GPS doesn't dysfunction. It simply says, "Oh, I see where you are. I'm going to reroute you to help you get back on track with where you were going." And that's what I hope is the why that someone would choose to do this. Is they want something that helps them reorient when real life is happening and they get thrown off their course. So I'm excited that we opened this topic, and I definitely look forward to us exploring it further. Any closing thoughts, Kathryn?
No, you got it.
All right, let's tie down today with Building Bigger Lives. You can, of course, find us on many different places out on the internet. We like to remind you that this is an Apple podcast recording that's also available on our YouTube channel at Building Bigger Lives. That's also the same name we have on Instagram, if you prefer that platform as a way to stay in touch with us. The point of us directing you to those is simply this: we'd love to hear your comments. We'd love to hear your questions, and we'd love to engage with you. So please use those tools and help us know where to connect with you better. And let's build on this topic so that when we come back in the future, we maybe invite someone with a different perspective that could add to that subject. And we look forward to sharing that with you down the road. But for today, thanks again. Like, subscribe, and share as you do. And we will see you on another episode of Building Bigger Lives.